Good morning, everyone. I'm Gönül Tol. I'm the director of the Turkey program at the Middle East Institute and also senior fellow at MEI's Frontier Europe initiative. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's event to discuss the implications of the Russian invasion of Ukraine for Turkey. As many of you might know, Turkey has maintained a delicate balance following the invasion. On the first day, for instance, President Erdoğan characterized the Russian invasion as unacceptable, and he grew bolder as the conflict worsened. Turkey provides drones to Ukraine, closed the straits to the warships of warring parties, and Turkey also closed its airspace to Syria-bound Russian aircraft. But Turkey has not joined the Western-imposed sanctions on Russia and also welcomed Russian oligarchs and their money. And Erdoğan's recent threats to block Sweden and Finland's bids to join NATO have been interpreted by many people as an effort to please Putin, Russian President Putin. I personally do not agree with that argument, but so this complicated picture leaves us with many questions. Is this balancing act becoming precarious? How has the invasion affected Turkey's standing and geopolitical calculations, or what about Turkey standing within NATO? So to answer all these questions and more, I'm joined by an excellent panel of experts. And I would like to start with Alper Coşkun. You have their detailed bios. Alper is a senior fellow within the Europe program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. And he's a retired career diplomat of 30 years. He was the Director General for International Security Affairs at the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, covering NATO and transatlantic relations. Our next speaker is General Philip Bridlov. The general is retired. He's the retired general of the United States Air Force. And during almost 40 years of service, he held a variety of demanding command and staff positions, including Supreme Allied Commander of Europe and Commander of US European Command. And finally, Dr. Serhat Güvenç, who is a professor of international relations at Istanbul-based Kadir Has University. And he's the author of several books and articles, including 60 Years in NATO, Turkey's Contributions to Transatlantic Security. Well, thank you all for taking the time to talk to us today. I'm really looking forward to the discussion today. And let me kick off the discussion with a question about the military dynamics on the ground. So I'll start with you, General. My question is, where are we in the conflict? Russia has failed to seize Kiev, and it has been trying to take full control of Donbass in the east. And looking at how the invasion progressed so far, what can you tell us about Russian military performance and also military dynamics on the ground?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here, and it's good to see friends on the Zoom this morning. So not to go too far back, but clearly a strategic defeat for Russia in the north around Kyiv. They had bad expectations of how the war was going to go, and they sent the force inappropriately prepared. And logistically, I think, was the biggest problem for them. And then a very determined defense dealt them a strategic defeat. Since that time, they have tried to reestablish an attack in the north in the vicinity of Kharkiv, and once again have had to retreat from those positions. So Russian performance so far has not been what we expected from them. But they took nearly a 2-week hiatus and they refit, reorganize, and refurbish their force, and now have set to purpose in the east and the southeast with a veracity that is important. Yes, they are not moving at the speed they want. And yes, they are behind the timeline they really wanted. And yes, we believe they have reduced their objectives as far as going to Odessa and other places. But the bad news is they are making incremental progress in the east. And we fear now a small breakthrough that has surfaced that could be threatening to some portions of the Ukrainian forces. I think the most important thing, and I'll end with this, is that it appears that Russia has once again adjusted its objectives. And fearfully now, it seems that they are trying to consolidate and enforce the land that they have rather than focus on expanding it. There's a couple of small pockets where the Ukrainians are giving them trouble, and they're trying to eliminate those pockets and consolidate what they have. And my fear then is that they will then ask for a ceasefire and negotiations, which they hope will cement more Ukrainian territory under their control in the international eyes. And I think I'll leave it there for questions.
Yeah, just as a follow-up, so is taking Kiev from Putin's point of view, and given how he's performed on his military perform on the ground, is taking Kiev and overthrowing the government there, is it still a viable option, or how likely?
So I think in the short term, taking Kyiv is off the table. They've been defeated, and they're having a hard enough time fighting in the east now. I do not believe replacing the Zelensky government is off the table. In fact, I believe that in the southeast, they're trying to set a set of conditions that would politically put him in trouble for not being able to retake the land. And as you can see, they're starting to sell Ukrainian grain, and they're blockading the movement of Ukrainian grain. So I believe they are still trying to bring an immense amount of pressure on the Zelensky government in hope that would fall. But may I just put one bad data point on the future? There are already those that think Russia is now building a second force and getting ready and thinking about, in the next cold weather period, another run on Kyiv with a better planned force. So we need to keep that in the back of our mind.
Thank you, General. Before I turn to Alper, let me tell our audience that please feel free to ask any questions using the question button on your screen. I'll try to incorporate those questions. Alper, I would like to turn to you next. So how does Ankara interpret the picture General Breedlove pointed to just now? Do you think there is worry that this conflict might drag on for years, or is there an assessment that the West will get distracted and Russia will win the war soon? And I have a follow-up question, but let's start with that.
Sure. I think the worry and the expectation is that we're moving into a longer-term phase of attrition in this conflict. The presidential spokesperson, Ibrahim Kalin, tweeted some time ago that the war is entering a new phase. And that was when Russia had recalibrated, as the general just mentioned, and announced the end of phase one of the operation, which was a veiled way of confessing that it had not been able to succeed, but it was refocusing on the East. And at that point, when that transition, if you will, was taking place in theater, Turkish authorities, through Ibrahim Kalin, made the point that it is entering a new phase, a long-term phase, and one in which he described as a new Cold War. So I think the worry in Ankara is that it will take longer than one would wish a conflict scenario to go on for. And that obviously complicates the scenario for Turkey, because this is probably the worst thing that could have happened as far as Turkey's interests are concerned, given the implications for Turkey as a regional country, but also because of the state of the Turkish economy. And as the rest of the world is suffering, Turkey is additionally burdened by the fact that the Turkish economy was already in dire straits because of a lot of mistakes and unorthodox policies that have been implemented. And of course, this has also undermined Turkey's desire to be a kingmaker, a peace broker, if you will. Initially, there was a lot of expectation and hope that maybe Turkey's good standing, both in Kiev and Moscow, could lend itself well to Turkey facilitating the process. And we saw 2 rounds of that taking place in Turkey, which at the time was a positive development because it represented a transition from these talks taking place in Belarus to them taking place in a NATO country in Turkey, which I think was positive as far as Western interests and Turkey's standing in that regard is concerned. But right now, obviously, those have come to quite a bit of a stalemate. And while Turkey is retaining its good relations, if you will, with Moscow, you can see the same as far as Ukraine is concerned. But the more that it goes on, the more difficult it will be for Turkey to continue what you refer to as this balancing act. And I think that's where the challenge is for Turkey.
Well, given all these high stakes for Turkey, the ones that you articulated so well, is Turkey taking steps to prepare for different scenarios? I mean, one critical region is obviously the Black Sea. Is Turkey doing anything differently there, for instance, in response to the changing dynamics to the following the invasion? For many years, as you know better than I do, Turkey favored regional arrangements in the region to address regional concerns instead of a stronger NATO presence there. But Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014 led to a rethink in that strategy. So where does Turkey stand now on the question of stronger NATO presence in the region?
I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges for Turkey also because we're going into a NATO summit. NATO has already deployed battle groups, as you know, in Romania, Bulgaria, in addition to Slovakia and Hungary, which was the second round of these types of battle groups being deployed in the face of Russian aggression after the Baltics and Poland after 2014. So NATO is on an upward trajectory in terms of boosting its deterrence and defense capabilities in the region. And obviously, the maritime domain in the Black Sea is an important issue that will be debated in the summit. Now, you rightfully pointed out, Turkey has traditionally approached Black Sea security through 3 main pillars, basically. One is it has advocated for regional cooperation and regional ownership. The second, it has prioritized precluding escalation in the Black Sea. And the third has been safeguarding and implementing the Montreux Convention. Now, the first 2 have been undermined by Russia's actions. It's difficult to talk about non-escalation when there's a state of war. And it's very difficult to advocate for regional cooperation and ownership when regional countries are at war with each other. And I would argue that this became a problem even before 2014, in 2008, when Russia and Georgia went to war. So it's been very difficult for Turkey to advocate this policy, which on paper always made sense, but in practice was difficult because of the reluctance of other regional partners. And this is where Turkey will have to make a recalibration, particularly going into the NATO summit. And I think it will be wise for Turkey to take the lead in coming forward with some initiatives and putting on the table its suggestions as to how it can increase NATO's situational awareness in the Black Sea, how it can take the lead, not necessarily in escalating the NATO's presence in the Black Sea, but in ensuring that the show of deterrence and show of force by NATO and allies like Turkey is present in the Black Sea.
Well, I'm not too hopeful after having heard Turkish Defense Minister Hulusi Akar's recent statements where he said, we have been talking to our Western partners, our NATO partners, to make sure that they don't propose or push for a stronger NATO presence in the region because we do not want to provoke Russia. And this was a recent statement. I mean, how do you read that ahead of this summit?
The Turkish psyche there is about making sure that distant countries that have the luxury of going into the Black Sea for 15 days because of the restrictions of the Montreux Convention do not provoke an incident in the Black Sea that at the end of the day might pit Turkey as the most capable and largest military presence in the region with Russia. Because at the end of the day, if things go sour, Turkey will have a continuing confrontation, whereas non-literal states have, quote unquote, the luxury of entering the Black Sea domain and exiting afterwards. So I think it's understandable that Turkey is more hesitant in terms of how this should proceed. And Turkey has the experience of the 2008 Georgia experience, where in the Turkish eye, there was a little bit of provocation that took place at the time. So you have these sentiments playing into it. But I think the suggestion that Turkey does not want escalation falls on deaf ears nowadays because there's a state of war. And I think Turkey really needs to change its talking points in this regard.
Serhat Hocam, let me turn to you next. There's a big debate about Russian military blunders in Ukraine. As you know, first phase of the offensive was held back by intelligence weaknesses and poor planning and logistics. Western defense officials point to, I don't know if General Bridlow, if these are the figures that you're hearing, but recently I've heard Western defense officials saying close to 20,000 Russian casualties. And also there are losses in material, which is quite significant. So given that, and the fact that Turkey has close defense ties with Russia, and there are reports that Turkey could buy Russian fighter jets. So given that complicated picture, do you think Ankara might reconsider the close security partnership that it has cultivated with Russia in recent years?
Thank you, Dr. Tol. Thanks for inviting me. And I'm attending a conference here in Mersin. Every 2 years we meet as international relations scholars of Turkey to discuss issues of relevance to Turkey. And there is no single paper on Ukrainian conflict. I mean, we have about 150 papers and about 50 panels. So none deals with Ukraine. This is not, this doesn't reflect the deliberate neglect, of course, but nevertheless, we talk about the situation in Ukraine and we exchange ideas and information. As regards to the Russian casualties, I mean, a very close associate of mine, Dr. Sıtkı Egeli, just passed on to me an interesting information about a Russian fighter pilot, a 63-year-old retired Russian pilot who was killed while flying a Su-25 jet over Donbass. So if this story is true, I mean, this tells something about how desperate Russia is generating forces to sustain its military posture in Ukraine, let alone, regroup and re-prepare, retrain, and re-equip to resume the momentum of their attack. So, and on top of that, and every expert, every reliable expert I have listened to so far is kind of surprised by the Russian failure to secure air superiority, if not air dominance, over Ukraine. And, there are a variety of explanations offered, but one thing is certain, that Russia lacks sufficient number of modern cutting-edge combat aircraft for itself. So therefore, buying Russian hardware will not be an option for Turkey in the foreseeable future. So that should be off the table, because Russia needs those equipment for itself. And even in peacetime, Russian aviation industry's ability to produce high-tech fifth generation, 4.5 generation combat aircraft was limited anyway. I mean, at one point during the pandemic, I think they were able to roll off only 5 units, in a single year. Therefore, Russia does not seem to be a realistic option for Turkey as an alternative suppliers of modern military hardware. But this may indeed limit the prospects for Turkish-Russian military cooperation, especially Turkish procurement of arms. But the current debacle around surrounding, Finnish and Swedish bid for NATO membership suggests that Ankara does not share the threat perceptions of its allies. First and foremost, Ankara doesn't see Russia as a threat yet. So I think that accounts for this Turkish behavior of not following in the footsteps of other members of the alliance. And from this point, Turkey sees Russia still a potential future partner, and therefore it would like to see Russia survive this with as little damage as possible. Otherwise, Turkey will lose one of its, basis for its pursuit of strategic autonomy in NATO. So a Russia that survives more or less intact this debacle will help Turkey enhance its diplomatic and military autonomy from its Western allies. Maybe I should stop here if you have any follow-up questions.
I would like to go back to that point, which is really important. I mean, what you said, I think we should also talk about different scenarios and talk about how this might all play out and what are Turkey's options. So great points. And also I want to go back to the Sweden and Finland issue, which is very critical. But we have a question from the audience, which I guess that's a question posed to you. Does Russia have the tanks and manpower for a second attack on Kiev? That's the question.
That's a question to me or to the general?
Whoever would like to address, please feel free.
Well, let me share, my ideas first, and I'm sure the general will have more on this. Well, I depend on Western media to follow, what's going on in Ukraine. And the Western sources suggest that the Russians kind of pulled out their T-64s from storage, and they were planning to, commit them to battle. We're talking about, Cold War vintage tanks, main battle tanks. So this tells a lot about, what Russia can achieve, because with the top-notch equipment, with supposedly, combat-ready tactical battle groups, Russia was able to achieve this much with, second-rate equipment and even poorly trained soldiers. Probably Russia will, at least in the foreseeable future, will not be able to achieve more than consolidating those small territorial gains it has made so far.
General, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, I agree with everything that's said. Here is, I think, the two dynamics that we have to think about. Russia went into this ill-prepared. They had a completely false expectation. They planned to a false set of assumptions, and it is really hard to change that once you're engaged in battle, especially when you're losing. And so, again, people think that the 2-week hiatus when they were setting up to refit, refurb, reorganize to attack in the East that would have been hard for an incredibly good military to do. And it was probably not enough time. And now they're again engaged, probably ahead of their headlights, as we say. They have lost a lot of their best equipment, and formations have been severely damaged. They put some of their very best against this in the beginning. And so the answer is, I believe that if you just look at numbers that are still in Russia, they can rebuild another large force if they wait all the way to the next cold period to organize themselves. But it is not going to be their best forces. It's not going to be their best equipment. And as was brought up, they have failed to establish air superiority over the battlefield, which should have been a major boon for them in this battle. And so I think the answer is, if you just look at numbers, they have the ability to build a force to reattack if they want to. Do they seriously have the forces they need and the capabilities they need to do that? I think they're going to be very hard pressed to put that force together.
General, let's stay with you. I have a question about the bigger picture here. So as far as I know, you have said since the invasion in Ukraine started that you really appreciated this administration's efforts to mobilize NATO partners to send a strong message to Russia. And my question is, what else can the US administration do to put an end to all of this and make sure this doesn't happen again in the future? And I don't just mean giving more weapons or jets, which is obviously critical, but in terms of putting in place a long-term Black Sea policy, which, in my opinion, has been lacking despite pleas from regional countries.
Well, first of all, let me violently agree with your latter statement. We are way, way overdue having a real Black Sea policy. And we are way overdue trying to pull together. Actually, I love what Alper said about the three sort of basic pillars of Turkish Black Sea approach. And I actually agree with the first one, that there needs to be a regional approach. I would love to see Turkey take leadership of a real sort of Black Sea focus. That could be seen as an honest broker, but that would also entail working to keep Russia in the right places. I mean, right now, I don't believe anybody in Turkey signs up to the blockade of Ukraine. You know, there are things happening now that even though Turkey and NATO, Turkey, US may be having disputes, but I can't see that Turkey would sign up to the grain blockade of Ukraine. And so the first one, Gönül, is exactly what you said. We need to develop a US Black Sea strategy and a NATO Black Sea strategy. And it would even be better if that NATO Black Sea strategy was married to an EU Black Sea strategy, because the commerce of the Black Sea is so important to the world. So that's item one. The other things that I think have to be done here is that we have to do, we meaning the West now, not just the United States, we have to do what we said we were going to do, and that is give Ukraine everything it needs. We have said that we're doing that. At a very high level, we've stood in front of the microphone and said we're doing that, but in fact, we have not. We have not given them things like long-range artillery, which they need. We have not given them coastal defense cruise missiles of sufficient variety and capability. We have not given them one small dose of medium and high altitude air defense. There are those, I don't join them, but there are those who believe that this is all on purpose because they want to force Ukraine to the table and they're afraid to enable Ukraine to win. But the fact of the matter is, we in the West have to decide that, in my opinion, we have to decide that Ukraine and its future is to be determined by Ukrainians, and we need to keep our nose out of it. We need to support their decisions and help them move forward. And I'll just close with one thing. If you want to look across recent history and look for an imperfect leader that turns out to be a magnificent wartime leader, I must tell you, President Zelensky, while there are a lot of people who have complaints with him, he is a wartime leader, and I think he deserves our support.
General, one follow-up question before I turn to Alper. There are two questions for you, Alper, from the audience. But General, you underlined the need to for the US administration to craft a more serious Black Sea strategy. But do you see the signs of that? Do you think this administration is working on a long?
No, and I think the topic of our meeting today is one of the biggest problems. Our government has not yet forged a path ahead with Turkey, and you will not have a Black Sea strategy without Turkey. There are other great nations in the Black Sea, love them and their devotion to NATO and all of that. But Turkey is geostrategically critical to a Black Sea policy. This is my opinion I'm sharing with you, please, just mine. But we need to resolve our way forward with Turkey. We need to remember that we're on the same team and find a teaming approach. And then we need to sit down and talk to the nation that should be the anchor of the Black Sea policy and develop one. And again, as I mentioned before, just one more time, NATO policy and EU policy, and it would really be good if those two were closely tied together.
Well, it's not, I think, just about Turkey. Obviously, Turkey is the key player in the region. But what I'm worried about is this administration and previous administrations too. They haven't really thought about the Black Sea in a serious manner. And all these countries that we've been talking about, and even since 2008, when Russia did what it did in Georgia, these regional countries have been inviting, asking the US to have a serious conversation, and they haven't. Nothing has come out of that. And I remember our Frontier Europe initiative. We were, and generally you're part of that. So we were trying to put together experts and policymakers to make sure that there's a more serious conversation going on in this town. We realized that the people we invited from various administrations, there was this just lack of information, lack of a strategic understanding of the importance of the region. So to me, that's not really an encouraging sign.
Just one more 15 minutes, and then we'll turn to the real experts, or 15 seconds. So you know me, I'm not a political person. And in fact, what I'm about to say really bashes both sides of the political aisle. I believe that we have had a series of administrations who see the Black Sea as a distraction and a diversion of their resources. They want to focus on shifting to China, and the Europe and Southern Europe and the Black Sea continue to get in the way of that. And so we have not had serious focus on this in the past. And that is Phil Breedlove's opinion, and Phil Breedlove's only. I don't speak for anybody in that, but it sure seems to me that people want to get past this because they think they have bigger fish to fry. And this is the biggest fish in the pond, right?
Well, we've been complaining about lack of long-term strategy in Washington vis-a-vis the region. There's a question from the audience asking whether there is such long-term vision in Ankara regarding region, and that's posed to you, Alper. And there's another question for you from a good friend, Steve Flanagan from Rand Corporation.
Well, one would hope that there is, but I'm not sure that that's the case. But either way, I think what Turkey's trying to do, and you see that, is, it's thinking beyond the war in Ukraine, because we've had different experiences in our neighborhood with different regimes. Saddam's a good example. The Shah in Iran is a good example. They've all come and left, but the countries remain, and the challenges in different forms remain. And the same will be true as far as Russia is concerned. So though it may seem opportunistic in this current atmosphere and state of affairs, Turkey obviously is trying to retain a position where it is not perceived in Moscow as sort of taking a position that turns its relationship with Russia or its engagement with Russia as a new frontier, where there's a continuing divide, if you will, between the two countries. Now, that is, of course, a difficult proposition under the current circumstances, but in terms of long-term thinking, it makes sense. And Serhat Hoca also outlined the different dynamics and interests that Turkey has as far as Russia is concerned, which is why it's positioning in that manner. So to the extent that one can see that as being long-term strategic planning, yes, we can argue that's taking place, but I think one of the challenges for Turkey is the way in which this new presidential system is functioning and how decisions are being taken. I think the way the Turkish position on Sweden and Finland's bid to join NATO popped up out of the blue, catching everyone by surprise, including maybe the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs was a good example to that. So that speaks to how well and coordinated strategizing is taking place in Turkey nowadays. That would be my answer to that question.
Yeah, and also Steve notes that Senator Shaheen and other members of the US Senate have drafted legislation calling for the US government to develop a comprehensive strategy toward the Black Sea region in cooperation with NATO allies and EU partners. But he also has a question to you, Alper, which is, well, Turkey taking on a leadership role in the Black Sea on maritime domain awareness, etc. How do you assess the Turkish government's willingness to work with Romania and Bulgaria to develop a regional strategy and response to Russian aggression?
First of all, I think this idea of developing a Black Sea strategy has suffered very much from what the general pointed out, the regression in Turkey's relations with Washington and its traditional allies in the West. Turkey has seen the debate over Black Sea issues in the past almost decade, if you will, taking place more so at the behest of the United States and with Romania particularly being in the forefront. So this dynamic in itself was negative, if you will, in terms of the perception that it led to in Turkey. And of course, there's a logical explanation to this in the sense that when you look at the capabilities in the region that I mentioned, and when you look at what would happen if there were a hostile situation between NATO and Russia, in all reality, Turkey would find itself in the forefront of NATO's efforts there. So it's understandable that Turkey is hesitant or more careful in terms of how this debate is taking place. But the question that none of us have answered up to this point in time, and I think in the debate about this need for a Black Sea strategy, is what is it that we're trying to strategize? Are we trying to strategize the maritime domain alone? That does not make sense. It has to be the Black Sea, the basin, and all of the security considerations that affect the Black Sea basin that need to be borne in mind. For example, if there's a rapprochement between Turkey and Armenia, why is the United States not in the picture? When Armenia and Azerbaijan are trying to mend fences after the war and trying to solve their problems, why is the European Union in the lead and the United States so muted on these affairs? So I think when strategizing about the Black Sea in general, we need to think beyond the maritime domain. And that's where I think Turkey would be interested in having that type of a debate, because when you zero in solely on the maritime domain, with the constraints that the Montreux Convention brings on the Black Sea, Turkey finds itself sort of in the lead of both undertaking the effort, but also taking the brunt of any successive challenges that might come out of that. But this is a debate that needs to be had more extensively with Turkey, not without Turkey. And I think maybe the strategic mechanism that the US and Turkey recently announced might be a good platform for experts from both sides to debate this, particularly in the context of Ukraine, where I think there could be some headway, particularly going into the NATO summit.
Excellent point, Alper. Now, this is a question, I mean, Alper, you can answer, but Serhat Hocam, please feel free to answer as well. Now, Turkey faces a range of vulnerabilities from an emboldened or isolated Russia. And let's unpack different scenarios here. Let's assume that Russia wins the war. Do you think this would heighten Turkey's threat perceptions vis-a-vis a more aggressive Russia, primarily in the Black Sea, and push Turkey closer to NATO? Or are we going to see the opposite, because Turkey fears a Russian retaliation due to its support to Ukraine during the invasion, and thus distance itself from NATO, not to provoke Putin? So this is the first scenario in which Russia wins. So what's your take on this? And please, Alper and Serhat Hoca, please feel free to go ahead.
Serhat Hoca, please go ahead. I spoke a lot, and then I'll chip in after you.
Okay, thank you. I don't have much to offer in the way of an answer, but well, a Russian victory, and I'm not saying that, I mean, this will be the case for the military and civilian bureaucracy in Ankara, but for the new political elite in Turkey, this will be a proof that the West is on decline. So this is how they're going to position themselves, you know. Therefore, this will be seen as a promising opportunity to enhance Turkey's voice in the World Councils. Therefore, a Russian victory, in a way, will improve Turkey's resilience to pressures from its Western allies. This will probably be the political interpretation of the situation. But as for the bureaucracy, especially the security bureaucracy, Russia winning the war in Ukraine, you know, achieving its political objectives more or less, will be seen as a greater threat than in the past. And such a situation would be likely to create tension between the politicians and the security bureaucracy. At the end of the day, I mean, under the circumstances, the political actors can prevail. But nevertheless, I mean, Russia winning the war in Ukraine, is a very distant possibility. And indeed, Ankara's primary objective is to make sure that, you know, a Russian defeat becomes something manageable, you know, for Russia and for Turkey. I think it was about a month and a half ago, you know, both the U.S. Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense visited Ukraine, and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was very vocal in his expression of the objectives in Ukraine, you know, and more or less he said something along the lines that they would like to see a Russia with degraded military capabilities so that it could not threaten any of its neighbors. I don't think Turkey shares this, this objective with the United States. If this is the objective, I don't think Ankara fully subscribes to such an end scenario. And I'm going to stop here.
Well, there's before going to, I think General would like to intervene, right?
Well, yes. First of all, the nobody is really going to win this war at this point. Ukraine, even if they were to get back to the pre-war lines, what has happened to their country is just devastating. And Russia clearly is not going to win the war in the fashion that originally desired. And I think the Zelensky administration will stand through this. And that was probably their biggest objective in the real sense. But I think that the real problem for me, and I hate to sort of change the conversation, but the real problem for me is that if we allow this bad behavior to stand, or worse, we reward this bad behavior, and Russia gets to keep all this land that is grabbed, and then it turns it into a frozen conflict. What will eventually happen is Ukraine will change, because their economy is going to be really pressed to recover from what's happened to their ports and the land that Russia has grabbed, and what they're doing to their ability to harvest and move grain. I think that freezing or having a ceasefire that legitimizes where Russia is right now is going to be disastrous in the long term for Ukraine.
Sorry, Alper, would you like to add anything to what Serhat Hoca has said so far?
Sure. I think the dynamics that Serhat Hoca is pointing out to are relevant in the sense that, theoretically speaking, if Russia were to win, this would vindicate Russia romantics in Turkey. But realistically speaking, I think we're past that point. There's no way, in my opinion, that Russia is going to win this war, even if on the ground it reaches some conclusions that it can try and portray as victory. That's clearly the case as far as I'm concerned. And as far as Turkey is concerned, should Russia come out with some gains, of course, the scenario that Turkey is most probably in the context of the Black Sea eyeballing is whether, should Russia be able to consolidate its position in the east of Ukraine, it would then continue, though the general said that doesn't seem to be the expectation. But if it were to continue with a westward push, and establish a continuum between its forces on the east and those in Transnistria, in effect landlocking Ukraine and gaining further access to the coastline in the Black Sea. Then, of course, Turkey will be reminded of what Russia has done after it annexed Crimea, where it deployed a lot of anti-access area denial assets, but it also deployed a lot of missile strike capabilities. And it was in 2016 that the Russian Chad spoke of Russia's ability to strike the Bosphorus, in other words, Istanbul. So these don't fall on deaf ears in Turkey, and nor does Turkey's experience, I would assume, with Russia in Syria or other theaters fall on deaf ears. You know, we're all captured by today's headlines, S-400, Putin and Erdoğan, but let's not forget, Russia is really Turkey's historical nemesis.
Well, you all sound like you think the more likely scenario is a protracted conflict and the more isolated Russia. So let's talk about that scenario. What would Turkey interpret that as an opportunity to grab in places like Syria, like South Caucasus, in North Africa, to advance its interests? In my opinion, I know that Erdoğan has been talking about launching another military incursion into northern Syria for some time now, for several years. And in fact, the latest one in 2019 had not been completed. He hadn't achieved his objective, which was creating a safe zone so he could send the Syrian refugees back there. So he's now talking about that, and this is perfect timing given the elections coming up, the rising nationalist backlash against the Syrian refugees. But I think aside from that, there are other factors in play here. One is the isolated, the marginalized position Russia has found itself in after the invasion. For instance, because of the casualties that Russian military suffered, Russia has withdrawn some forces from Libya. The Wagner forces, and some say that even Syrian mercenaries to be sent to Ukraine. Now, these are not confirmed, especially the Syrian mercenaries aspect is not confirmed. But others are saying, especially Arab media, that Russian forces are handing some bases in Syria to Iranian forces. They are withdrawing forces to compensate the losses on the ground. And another factor is that Turkey closed the its airspace to Syria-bound aircraft from Russia, which has also made Russia vulnerable militarily in Syria, especially if there's further push from this administration on Iraq, for instance, to close its airspace. So given that, maybe I thought that could be a consideration on Erdoğan's part to push for another military incursion into Syria now, because the conditions are ripe. It wasn't when he mentioned that in the fall of last year, in October, because there was strong resistance from Russia, from the United States, and now he might see this as an opportunity. A weakened Russia could provide Turkey many opportunities. So what's your take on that?
Well, I think you laid out the picture perfectly well with all the important variables that need to be borne in mind. There has been news, as you mentioned, that Russia is not necessarily withdrawing from Syria, but that it has been regrouping its forces in different areas. And I don't know if they have been handing over to the Iranians, but Iranian proxies seem to be establishing themselves in these zones of vacuum that this regrouping is creating in Syria. And that's exactly where you could potentially have a convergence between Turkey and the United States to talk about looking into the future. I don't see the same dynamic in the Southern Caucasus. I don't think that Russia's presence there is an opportunity cost that Russia cannot afford, at least yet. It's about 1,900 strong presence that it has there, and that is Russia's underbelly. But the challenge in Syria for Russia is greater. Now, Turkey's decision, as President Erdoğan has announced it, an upcoming possible new incursion into Syria, would be a natural continuum of policies up until this time. So in that sense, it's not necessarily a function of what's happening in Ukraine, but I agree with you that the circumstances in Ukraine and the circumstances that Russia finds itself in may have led Ankara to believe that this might be the opportune moment. And of course, we haven't mentioned it, but let's mention the big D word, domestic politics. I think it lends itself very well now in Turkey.
Yeah, Excellent point. Serhat Hocam, if you have anything to add to that, go ahead. If not, I'll pose you my next question.
Just a very short note to what Ambassador Coşkun has just said. The Russian-Turkey relationship before 24th of February was a relationship of asymmetrical interdependence favoring Russia. So now the situation came around. Now this time, I mean, there is this relationship of interdependence between the two countries, but the asymmetry is favoring in Turkey's favor this time. And so President Erdoğan has this habit of seeing the world as in terms of opportunities rather than constraints. And the unfolding situation in Syria, if those reports are accurate that Russians have been withdrawing their equipment and troops from Syria, provides a perfect window of opportunity to resume what Turkey had to stop back in 2019 with the American pressures, I would say. So we may expect such a move, but whether Erdoğan's ability to deliver on what it promised the Turkish public back in 2019 in terms of creating a safety belt or safe zone along Turkey's borders would help him, change the domestic agenda, because it's the economy that tops the agenda, and I don't think it will have a lasting effect on the thinking of Turkish voters in the upcoming elections.
Yeah, excellent point. And I would also add that he's going to frame this potential Syria incursion as not just an answer to the terrorism problem, which always plays well in Turkish nationalist politics, but also he will pitch himself as the leader who could address one of the biggest problems of the country, which is the Syrian refugees. So let's put it out there. And Serhat Hoca, so my question to you is, I want to also talk about the implications of future of the invasion for Turkey's domestic defense industry. Western sanctions imposed on Turkey after Turkey launched the Syria incursion in 2019, and also after Turkey helped Azerbaijan in the latest Nagorno-Karabakh conflict war. All these sanctions dealt a significant blow to Turkish defense industry. And one of the most problematic areas is the bottleneck that these sanctions have created for producing engines, like for ships and for jets and all that. So Turkey does not have the know-how to produce these engines. And that was one of the reasons why Turkey signed an agreement with Ukraine before the invasion. So Ukraine could produce these engines. So my question is, how much the invasion jeopardized those plans? And if they have to a significant degree, what are some of the alternatives that Turkey is entertaining?
Yeah, that was the original question. You kind of told me that you would ask me in this event, and I did some homework. Cooperation with Ukraine seemed to offer a good way out of these Western sanctions, various embargoes, open, overt or covert embargoes on Turkey, and a number of critical defense industry projects would be seriously affected by the Russian invasion in Ukraine, especially in terms of supplying engines, procurement of engines for various platforms, including Hürjet, this domestically designed and manufactured advanced trainer and light attack aircraft. Indeed, it was originally slated to be powered by General Electric F404 engine. Then it was redesigned to accommodate a Ukrainian turbofan engine. It's IA-333 of SIH engine, which was struck by Caliber missiles 2 days ago. So that facility was taken out by Russia. Therefore, that plant would not be able to supply engines for this Turkish advanced trainer. 2 helicopter projects would be adversely affected. One is a derivative of Italian Agusta A129 attack 2 T-93, which was slated to receive Ukrainian engines, plus Turkey's utility helicopter, which was under development. So it would suffer from lack of engines. And plus, I think, which we have not discussed as much, but Ukraine, I think it was 2019, Ukraine ordered 4 Ada-class corvettes from Turkey. One would be built in Rahmi Koç shipyard in Istanbul, Pendik, and 3 would be built in Mykolaiv shipyard in Ukraine. That part of Ukraine was not occupied, invaded as yet, but nevertheless, it's not very far from the contested parts of the country. And also, the Ukrainians kind of received Turkish agreement to install their own engines, gas turbine engines to their corvettes. So that project is in limbo, and that puts Turkish defense industry in a difficult situation. Ukraine seemed to unlock all these dilemmas, all of a sudden. And more importantly, a cutting-edge technology for Turkey is the unmanned aerial vehicles. I mean, a number of projects, including Akıncı and Mius, would be also affected. And Turkey now needs to find alternative suppliers of engines for all these platforms. Although there is an effort, going on, an ambitious effort to design and develop all these engines, domestically, indigenously, but it is not likely to happen in the short term. I put together a paper with a group of other academics about, the impact of war in Ukraine on Turkish defense industry. I wrote the part on Turkish defense industry. I kind of came to the conclusion that the Ukrainian Turkish defense cooperation may take the form of supplying Turkey with the blueprints, the know-how, the technology, and the trained personnel to, produce, manufacture all these items locally in Turkey with Ukrainian assistance. Otherwise, it's a difficult situation. Then Turkey has to turn to its traditional Western suppliers.
Yeah, Alper, please go ahead.
I just wanted to add something to that, because recently I hosted a webinar and the Ukrainian ambassador from Ankara was present there. And this was one of the questions I posed him, the significant agreements that Turkey had reached with Ukraine and how he saw the future of these agreements. The plant that Serdar Hoca mentioned had not been bombed at the time. So theoretically, it was still a possibility that it would continue as originally planned. But one option that he did mention, and he said that not plans, but some thought had already been put into it, was to carry over the production with know-how coming from Ukraine in Turkey. So I think Serdar Hoca's assumption seems to be correct.
Excellent point. General Breedlove, lastly, I want to turn to you. As you all know, Finland and Sweden submitted their applications to join NATO, and these countries have long kept a careful balance and the neutral position between West and Russia. But obviously, the Russian invasion changed that, and Western leaders consider this as a historic moment that will really reshape Western security architecture in the decades to come. But President Erdoğan recently threatened to block these countries' bid to join NATO. And my question is, how does this recent move of Erdoğan affect Turkey's standing within NATO? There were already many problems, many concerns about Turkey's commitment to NATO before this, because of several things: Turkey's decision to purchase the Russian S-400 defense missile system, and the Turkish-Greek tension, Turkish problems with friends, divergence over Erdoğan's regional policy. We just talked about the Western sanctions imposed on Turkey. So the relationship between Turkey and its NATO partners were already strained. But Erdoğan's stance over Ukraine after the invasion had slightly improved the mood and created a kind of a goodwill in Western capitals. And now this Sweden and Finland decision. So how significant of a blow is this to NATO partners' perception of Turkey?
Well, clearly there is an impact. The nations, the long-standing nations of NATO who know Turkey, as you and I talked about in the prep for this, they understand that Turkey's diplomacy is very sophisticated. And I would tell you that there's a lot of the old NATO that expected something like this, because Turkish approaches to these things are, okay, here is an opportunity to move some things forward that we've been unable to move forward. I see a quiet optimism behind this, in that the nations are expecting to work this out with Turkey. I see that in a public sense, yes, this is going to hurt Turkey some. And my biggest worry is that it will further diminish Turkey's standing with the US Congress, both houses of the Congress. And that's where I think the bigger problems arise. I do believe we'll be able to work this out. I don't believe that Turkey in its heart of heart really intends to exclude Sweden, Finland and Sweden, but they do intend to extract some concessions on long-standing problems. And I think it's a process at this point.
Great. And please, very briefly, I want to pose these questions to you from the audience. It's about, so one is about the Russian development of nuclear power plant at Akkuyu in Turkey, whether that would play an inhibiting role in Turkish foreign policy calculations. So that's one question. And let me ask you another one, which is, how will Turkey react when, or if Romania, Ukraine, or Georgia would like to update or revise the Montreux Convention after Russian power in the Black Sea is diminished? So if you could very briefly address that, that would be great.
I think my two compatriots are far better prepared to answer those questions.
Okay,
shall I try and step in very quickly? For the second question on the Montreux Convention, Turkey would hate the idea and violently object to it. And I don't think it would be a good idea in terms of charting a course that is mutually beneficial in the Black Sea together with Turkey, because the fact of the matter is, you can't envisage something new in the Black Sea domain unless you have Turkey on board as well. So that would simply push Turkey more into a disruptive mode of behavior. So Turkey would hate the idea. There's no doubt about that. The Russian nuclear plant, I don't know how reasonable it is to still talk about the notion of interdependence, but that nuclear plant is something that Russia has built at its own expense, in the sense that it is financing the project. So there is an element of Russia's dependency on that project continuing as it needs to. But of course, it is going to be challenging should there be secondary sanctions that impact on the functioning of that project as far as Turkey and Russia is concerned. So that will be challenging.
All right. If you don't have any final words, let's end it there. Fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. I have many more questions, but unfortunately we've run out of time. So let's do this again soon. And thank you to our excellent panelists. I greatly enjoyed, and to all of you who joined us to listen, and see you again soon.
Thank you very much, and goodbye, everyone.
Bye.